Defund NATO to protect American freedoms. In recent years, the relationship between the United States and its NATO allies has come under increasing scrutiny. As global dynamics shift and new challenges emerge, it is time for America to reassess its role in the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, and consider a bold course of action, defunding NATO to protect our freedoms. The original purpose of NATO was established in 1949 with a clear mission: to protect the democratic nations of Western Europe from the growing threat of Soviet expansion. In its early years, the alliance was instrumental in maintaining peace and stability during the Cold War. However, the world has changed dramatically since then. The Soviet Union no longer exists, and the security landscape is vastly different. Yet NATO has continued to expand its scope and influence, often at the expense of American interests and values. NATO's growing influence and erosion of American sovereignty. As NATO has grown, so too has its influence over American foreign policy and, by extension, domestic affairs. What was once a mutual defense pact has morphed into an alliance that increasingly seeks to dictate the terms of U.S. engagement in global conflicts and, alarmingly, domestic issues. From dictating defense spending priorities to influencing decisions on national security, NATO's reach into American sovereignty has become increasingly pervasive. One of the most concerning aspects of this influence is the potential erosion of American freedoms. As NATO allies push for more unified approaches to global challenges, there is a growing risk that the U.S. will be pressured into adopting policies that conflict with the Constitution and the values it enshrines. The First and Second Amendments, in particular, are at risk as European allies advocate for stricter regulations on speech and gun ownership. The financial burden of NATO. The United States is by far the largest financial contributor to NATO, providing nearly 70% of the alliance's total budget. This financial burden has been justified in the past as necessary for global security. However, in a time when the U.S. faces significant domestic challenges, from crumbling infrastructure to rising national debt, the question must be asked: is this expenditure still in America's best interest? The billions of dollars spent annually on NATO could be better invested in addressing critical needs at home. By defunding NATO, America could redirect these resources to strengthen its own national defense, bolster economic growth, and improve the quality of life for its citizens. The argument that NATO is essential for American security no longer holds water when considering the modern threats we face, which are often more economic or cyber in nature than conventional military ones. Protecting American freedoms. The most compelling reason to defund NATO is the need to protect American freedoms. The U.S. Constitution guarantees certain inalienable rights, including freedom of speech, the right to bear arms, and the right to due process. These rights are the foundation of American democracy, and they must be defended at all costs. However, many of our NATO allies do not share the same commitment to these freedoms. European nations in particular have implemented strict regulations on speech, gun ownership, and other personal liberties. As NATO continues to push for greater alignment among member states, there is a growing danger that the U.S. will be pressured to conform to these standards, undermining the Constitution and the freedoms it guarantees. Defunding NATO would send a clear message that the United States will not compromise its sovereignty or its values. It would reaffirm our commitment to the Constitution and to the principles that have made America a beacon of freedom and democracy. A new path forward. Defunding NATO does not mean abandoning our allies or retreating from the world stage. Rather, it is an opportunity to redefine America's role in global security and to forge new partnerships based on mutual respect and shared values. The U.S. can and should continue to work with other nations to address global challenges, but it must do so on its own terms, without the constraints imposed by outdated alliances. A new path forward would prioritize bilateral relationships with countries that share America's commitment to freedom and democracy. It would focus on strengthening America's own national defense, reducing our reliance on foreign alliances, and ensuring that our foreign policy is guided by the interests and values of the American people. Conclusion: a call to defund NATO. The time has come for America to take a hard look at its involvement in NATO and to consider defunding the alliance in order to protect our freedoms. The world has changed, and the threats we face today are not the same as those of the past. By defunding NATO, the United States can reclaim its sovereignty, protect its constitution, and ensure that our resources are used to strengthen our nation rather than support an outdated and increasingly problematic alliance. Let us not be bound by the past, but instead boldly chart a course for the future, one that prioritizes American freedom, security, and prosperity above all else. The defense of our Constitution and the protection of our liberties demand nothing less.